And do you think social media and the internet actually makes everyone far more involved in the entertainment
absolutely,
aspect?
absolutely. I mean, do you know Mrs. Jellyby from Bleak House? From
Yes,
Dickens?
yeah.
It's like we're all Mrs. Jellyby now, right? Mrs. Jellyby is a passionate supporter of the war in the Ukraine. You know, Mrs. Jellyby is a character in Dickens's Bleak House, and she practices what Dickens calls telescopic philanthropy, which is a wonderful term, and she neglects her whole household and everything around her while dedicating all of her resources to the inhabitants of Boryobulaga on the Niger River. This was actually based on a real thing, which was the Niger expedition in the 1840s, which was a classic piece of liberal imperialism where they're like, we're going to go to Niger and help these poor natives grow cotton. We think cotton could be, it's sort of, whole thing is a shit show, like, you know, tropical disease, everybody dies, it's a disaster, right? You know, but it makes Mrs. Jellyby, who's like, you know, sending her savings to this thing, feel good. And so there's this kind of like feel-good liberal imperialism whose goal is to feel good. And because its true goal is not to do good, but to feel good, it does enormous amounts of evil. And yes, definitely sort of letting people get a taste of that drug through social media. You know, you put the Ukrainian flag in your Twitter profile.
I just found it was weird that sort of people, not nutty people, kind of, you know, very respected journalists in Britain with their blue ticks and so on, they would post a video of like a Russian tank being blown up and maybe even a corpse or something.
Maybe even a corpse.
And they would say something like, yeah. Or, you know,
or like the people that are excited about, you know, Dugin's daughter being blown up.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of hard-ons out there. That's really disturbing and weird. There was a story in the New York Times like 3 or 4 days ago, which was accompanied by this like beautiful picture of like a Ukrainian terrorist in a skull mask, and he's like a hero because he goes into like Russian-controlled Ukraine and blows up car bombs. And there's this line where he's like, anyone who would drive that car would be a traitor, you know?
Yeah. And did you see the Hello from London thing?
No, what was that?
The donors are sponsoring missiles that say Hello from London.
It's amazing. And these are peace activists.
They're
these
like
are people,
private peace activists.
They're peace activists, right? And they're just like, you know, contributing to like bombs and like, and it just shows the like insanity of that sort of way of thinking. And it really, like, that way of thinking is really, really deeply part of Anglo-American foreign policy for the last 200 years. And it's been reduced to this sort of reductio ad absurdum of like, hello from London, you know, the liberal imperialist bomb that blows you up, you know? And it's like, you know, peace through death, right? You know, it's ridiculous. It's Orwellian, right? You know? And it just goes to show that, like, anyone can believe anything in the pursuit of this, and they can basically believe that they're like finding peace through, like, you know, crowdfunding bombs. And it's like black humor. It's so creepy. It's funny, right? The hello from London thing is just like it's appalling, and yet it's a pattern that's been happening for a couple of centuries, and that may keep happening for centuries more.
Well, that's something you talk about a lot, about how, I mean, I think a lot of people like to think that we're always at sort of historical great junctures, and that somehow the sort of liberal empire is in decline now because it's so obviously, liberal countries are so obviously bad at doing it. So we must be reaching
we're bad at building, but we're, you know, it's like the dog that kills sheep. Like, we're good at destroying. Yeah. We can do the destroying part just fine. Yeah. You know? And then when it comes to, like, I mean, I'll admit that this is really painful. I believed in the war in Iraq. I believed in the invasion of Iraq. Right. I was a neocon. I'm so sorry.
I love this confessional tone.
And I really believed in it. I was like, come on, we did it for Germany. Why can't, you know, and it's like, honestly, if the U.S. invaded Germany now, there would be a civil war in Germany 30 years later. And yet, you know, the power of U.S. foreign policy is such that half of me, this is a little far-fetched, but, you know, it's like when they roll out Obama and put Assad must go on his teleprompter, I'm looking at this and I'm like, you know, if they rolled Obama out and put Merkel must go on his teleprompter, he could probably start a civil war in Germany, you know? And it's just like you don't really see the purpose of, like, U.S. foreign policy as basically like global arson. And that's what, when you basically bring down Gaddafi or Mubarak, sort of the mentality of like, I'm reaching out and creating freedom. And I see that in this country, foreign country that I've never been to, know nothing about, but I know that in this country there is one stone on top of another. And that bottom stone is being oppressed. Yeah. And therefore we must blow it up. Right? And now there is no stone on top of another, and we've created freedom. And this is like the cost of this, like the monetary cost of this. I mean, a lot of money goes into funding state, right? The monetary cost of this is like sort of trivial in terms of like the cost of like human destruction. I mean, you can go around the world and find places that were completely fine in 1960 and now are just incredibly scary places to be. There's a lot of that. So, that sense in which you're basically, like, if you go back to the Monroe Doctrine, sort of the original Monroe Doctrine was like, okay.
I thought you were talking about Portland there for a second, or Chicago or something. You're talking about the world.
Yeah, the world, right. If you go back to the Monroe Doctrine, the original Monroe Doctrine is, okay, no European kings ruling over the Americas. Yeah. And then, Napoleon III has this brilliant idea. It's like, the Americans seem busy with their civil war, so we'll appoint, how about a real emperor of Mexico? Surely you won't object to an emperor of Mexico. It's not colonial. And then the Americans get finished with their civil war, and the first thing they do is basically go and talk to Napoleon III. And they're literally like, we have this big army. It's not really doing anything right now. So your little colonialist adventure down in Mexico, that's over, right? And then Maximilian is like, no, I am one with the Mexican people. I will stay behind. And, he gets his ass shot. And so the rule, and they also try to have an empire in Brazil. They had an emperor of Brazil. And so the rule then extends to no kings or emperors or anything old regime-y in the Americas. Okay, that's fine. We don't need kings. We'll have dictators, right? And you have people like Porfirio Diaz in Mexico, or to give it its true name, Nueva España. And I like dead naming. Yeah. And it's a guilty pleasure. A man needs simple loves, dead naming and Paul Rouget,
and animalistic metaphors.
Indeed. And Woodrow Wilson is like, when Diaz leaves the building, Woodrow Wilson is like, okay, no, you can't have another dictator. That's over now. You need a constitutional president. And then the radicals in America, including like John Reed, are supporting Pancho Villa, who's this insane bandit. And basically, that kicks off the Mexican Revolution, which that's only killed like 1 million people, maybe 1.5 million. Small potatoes, right? And leaves Mexico in the state of, if you go to Mexico, basically anything that functions in Mexico was built either during the Porfiriato or is actually colonial. And sort of kicks off this like degringolade of Mexico into like revolution from which it really hasn't ever completely recovered.
Yes.
And, the same, John Reed, who's like the typhoid Mary of like Harvard Revolution, ends up in Russia, gives Russia, the treatment, right? Yeah. And Russia still, it's kind of maybe recovered a little bit, and you have this basically sort of epicenter of world revolution going around and doing this. Most people don't know. They sort of think of America as anti-Castro. If you actually read about the Cuban Revolution, it's like 3 guys in the hills, and then Herbert Matthews of the Times goes and interviews them, and then it's 30 guys, whatever he interviews, he's like, this is the future of Cuba, and then at the State Department, they'll read the New York Times, and they're basically like, okay, this is how we'll make sure that the future of Cuba is truly Cuba. We'll stop selling arms to Batista, right? Yes. And so basically, state overthrows the government of Cuba in order to get a nice liberal in there, and the liberal turns out to actually prefer the Soviet side of the fence.
Yes.
And, so you've basically, you kicked off the Cuban Revolution. And really, state and CIA are, unequivocal in the support of Castro. There's this, you can go and find the testimony of one of the last American ambassador to Batista, and he was a political appointee. He didn't agree with these people, right? And he's basically yeah, this was a basically foreign service designed revolution. And so Castro comes to New York in '56. He's treated as a hero.
Yeah.
He speaks at the UN. Everybody Norman Mailer writes the most embarrassing things about Castro, right? And so this is just sort of yet another case of America as the typhoid Mary of revolution. In fact, you can go back all the ways to the days of George Washington. And George Washington, in his farewell address, you maybe know about the farewell address, where he sort of preaches this, what later becomes called isolationism, where he's let's let the Europeans through their quarrels, they have kings and stuff. Of course, they have wars, with their stupid kings, but let's not worry about that, And you're oh, wow, what a dignified perspective. And what you don't realize when you hear this is, do you know the name Citizen Genet? No. He's the ambassador of revolutionary France to America. And he's a Jacobin, and he comes to America. And the Democratic Republicans at the time, basically he's okay, let's have a Jacobin revolution in America. And he makes himself such a nuisance that he has to be declared persona non grata. But, he finds there are definitely American Jacobins who want to go full reign of terror in the U.S. And, Jefferson is Thomas Paine, of course, actually goes to France and gets caught up in this garbage, right? Jefferson is oh, the tree of liberty must be watered with the blood of and so you have this sort of feeling that as soon as the American Republic is created, it sort of becomes this primary tumor of revolution, blood, and death. Yeah. And that virus is sort of always restrained enough in America by our sort of native aristocracy. It's a little like Dutch elm disease, which actually comes from China, where the Chinese elms are mostly immune to Dutch elm disease. And this is why Britain and America, despite being, you have people like Richard Price in the UK who are there are all these correspondence clubs that are corresponding with the Jacobins. You must know about Burke's collection of letters. Burke is basically, he's 10% of Englishmen support the Jacobins, and we're in a war against them. Yeah. Right? And, the whole French Revolution is kind of this outbreak of Anglophilia among the French elites. And so you sort of, to see the Anglo-Saxon world, as they say in France, basically as this sort of source of this revolutionary virus, in the same way that sort of China is the source of Dutch elm disease, but the Chinese elms are basically more or less immune.
Yes.
And so you never have one of these really sanguinary, crazy French or Russian-style revolutions in England, in America, but you have the American and English ideas are always front and center in these revolutions. What is Marx? Marx is an English gentleman. And he's a naturalized English gentleman. To be sure, he's a German Jew, but he does all his work in the British Library, right down the street. And so, to sort of have in my ideal world, this is a fantasy, but in my ideal world, Anglo-Americans would feel the same level of guilt about this predatory pattern that basically Germans feel today. Yeah. And the fact that the pattern sort of continues down to the present and shows no signs at all of stopping is really incredibly sick and twisted and disturbing.
But do you think that Americanism is a religion, in the sense that because we talked about revolutionary spirit and so on, the belief in America, or Shining City on the Hill and all that, it's so ingrained in the American psyche that America cannot stop wanting to be revolutionary.
Yes. And it goes back even before, so there's this wonderful pamphlet by Daniel Defoe called Shortest Way with the Dissenters. It's a really wonderful piece because it was actually Defoe himself was a dissenter. He was a dissenter journalist, and he wrote this piece as a piece of black propaganda, essentially, that was intended to be believed as if a high Tory had written it. And it was like a level of high Tory extremism that was basically not known in the day. He's basically writing this, like, basically arguing for treating the dissenters more or less the way Mary Tudor would have treated them. Yeah. He's like, de heretico comdurendo, he's like, I'm not saying, but, what's interesting about it is he's like, basically, like, if these dissenters, these Whigs, are allowed their way, then our, like, glorious monarchy will crumble into a republic. And he has this brief mention of America in there, and he's like, basically, we've been so lenient with these fuckers, if you'll excuse my French, that we let them go off to the New World and build their own, country there. Yeah. Basically, this is at a time when, Americans are like insisting up and down in like the 1770s that, we never meant, it was only a last resort of independence. We were just so oppressed, right? And here's Defoe writing in like 1706 or something. He's like, yeah, they have this like de facto independence thing going on, right? And, that's just an example of how we've been like lenient with these fuckers, and we should have deported them all to the West Indies to basically be like cotton slaves, right? Which was done in some cases. And what's fascinating is sort of the modernity of the right versus left conflict. And also the prediction, which is black propaganda. Defoe didn't mean any of this stuff, but actually what he's saying is true. He's like, basically, if we tolerate this, like, Whiggism and this, like, republicanism, we're going to end up right back in the Cromwell days, and we're going to basically lose our monarchy, which has indeed happened, and I guess you still have this, like, fake thing, right? But, the... and
it's still real on paper.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. She still has the power. She could veto acts of parliament if she wanted. Last time that was done... Queen Anne.
17, yeah.
And I think she only did it once. Yeah. And, why Anne doesn't restore the Stuarts, who the hell knows, right? And she is a Stuart.
Well, we've got to bring it back to America.
Let's bring it back to America. Let's bring it back to America.